It's good to have LeRoy and Judy share, and they spent time, as you know, in Mexico, Venezuela, which has been in the news a lot, and Cuba, where now our official relations with Cuba are much different than they were most of my life up to this point. And so as they share this evening, I trust that it'll be informative in what God did with and through them in parts of Latin America. We're going to open in a word of prayer, and I'm going to ask Ray to just lead us in an opening number in song, and then we're going to let LeRoy and Judy take the service from there.
It's kind of amazing to me. We'll look back at old slides and wonder who it was and what they were doing. And to us, it'll bring back many memories. And if the Lord helps us, we'll try to help you understand why we have wonderful memories. There's a kind of a key verse, or a verse that has been a guide for my life. First of all, the guide for our lives, Judy and I, has been the Apostle Paul. And we went to plant churches in an area where we did not know anyone or who it was or whatever, and there God led us to the right people. And there's another verse that the Apostle Paul used then that also became a guide for us through these years, when he said, in the fullness of time, God sent his son. And what I've been, I don't dare get into my office too much. Judy run me out of there. But anyhow, because she's the one that takes care of it now. And you'll notice tonight that every now and then I've got a little problem remembering or getting it all out straight. But that's all right. God knows my heart. And but anyhow, I've noticed this big old calendar. Maybe y'all have one that lays on your desk in your office. And so I kept watching that thing and looking where we are in our journey today and saying, you know, wonder if God really does have an appointment for me. So tonight what we want to talk about is the appointment that God had for us way back more than 40 years ago. And 50, Judy tells me. So the first slide that Judy's going to put up, if we get it geared up at the right place, it'll be a picture of her and Melissa. I better look at the screen. Let me turn it around.
Yeah, there it is.
You may ask, how in the world did you guys get clear down to Mexico from Pennsylvania? Well, that's what we went in. And we had one child, Melissa. She was 3 years old. She was going on 3. And but that year we had definitely sensed that God was calling us to go to Latin America to plant churches. With the brother in Christ, of course, they had other ideas, and I've known to be stubborn. And so one day after I'd had a talk with the bishop, and he didn't have anything but Nicaragua ready for us, I said, well, we're going to do what God's asked us to do. And we left. The time was the January. We left on January the 1st. That little car, that Buick convertible pulling that trailer, was everything that we had. We'd gotten rid of everything we had. When we were preparing to go in December, on the 17th of December, we had a household sale where we got rid of everything but the car. And it was 74 degrees on the 17th of December. Now, I think God might have been saying it's time to go. We have another picture of when we pulled out. A couple of days later, there was snow on the ground. So that's how we left. Today, we have gadgets on our vehicles that help us to find our way. What we've discovered is that God had a gadget that and he had a person who helps us always to find our way. And so we left out from Mexico having no idea where we were going to sound like Abraham. We just know that God said, get up and go. And so we said, simple faith, we got up and left. When we were making our final direction, plans to leave on New Year's, we met a family, a ministry family, a minister, his wife. They said that they heard that we were wanting to go to Mexico, and they said, well, we vacation in Mexico every year. And so we preach, we have services in the churches with the people. And so we talked a while. And he said, you know, if you want to go, if you're serious about going, we're going to go on the first week in January. And we're going by way of Biloxi, Mississippi, and Dallas, Texas. Now that's kind of a jagged path if you're going to the border in McAllen. But anyhow, we said, okay. He said, well, all you have to do is follow us. Meet us in Biloxi. We'll get together. Wife's, his sister-in-law's house. We did that. We spent the weekend in Biloxi. And went up to Interstate 20, I think it is, 40, which is, I've forgotten already. Anyhow, we drove up there. We've had a couple of these days the last few days. We were driving in sunshine. It was beautiful. We were up on 40 going across Mississippi and into Texas at Texarkana, south of Texarkana. And when we got there, started clouding up. I could still see the guy, and we were traveling on. He was in a car, I was pulling a trailer. And he usually let me catch up, but we went in to get fuel in East Texas. And it was starting to sleet. Now, if you've ever been in East Texas in a sleet storm, it's not the place you want to be pulling a camping trailer or a big one. So we're in this camping trailer car. We turned off to go in. We tried to signal to him that we were going for gasoline. Well, we were down to almost a crawl in the traffic. So we went in, and the traffic was, for all basic practical purposes, had stopped. We stayed there because the station had a canopy, and we pulled in under it. They weren't pumping any gas anyhow. And the next morning we said, now what do we do? That's where the GPS came in. God's precious Spirit was on board our car. And I can show you how. That's why I want to take this detour with you. We left East Texas the next morning. We got our tank fueled. It had cut through enough that you could drive on the interstate. We got on the interstate. We drove the rest of the way into Dallas. And I had remembered that they said something about 175 or something. And so when I just drove straight into Dallas. And when I came to the main road, Highway 175, it was a 4-lane highway. I made a right. Dallas was over here. And I was saying, well, it's got to be it. So we drove and drove. And I said, it looks like we're getting downtown. Maybe we should pull over and ask somebody. And sure enough, it wasn't like today. The people still talked to you and told you how to go and how to find it. And anyhow, I pulled into a filling station. And this gentleman came out to fuel my car. And I told him I was looking for a certain address on Highway 195. And he looked at my information I had and told me that I was going north, but I needed to be going south. That I was already on 175, and I needed to turn around. So we fueled, we turned around, we drove down into Dallas, or into Seagoville, south end of Dallas. And we're driving along on a 4-lane highway with frontage roads. And we got down there pretty well into... I've forgotten what the name of the side, anyhow, the town, Seagoville maybe it was, but the one we were looking for. And we got at the number, and on these frontage roads, people build on the second road back, not the main. So we got down, you have to know how Texas is to understand, but so we got down on the frontage road and started driving on the frontage road. Fortunately, on that section, it had a north-south where it was two-way traffic. And would you believe, we got down there a couple of miles or so, and we're looking at every car that goes by and everything we could find. And we looked over on the side road, and there was a house sitting over there, and the number of the house was the number we were looking for. I'm telling you, he guides our paths if we invite him in and allow him to. And I'm concerned now at my older age, or understand more, that God took us to Mexico and opened a path and led us to the people that we needed to work with to accomplish the need that there was, to fulfill the need there was there. And I'm fully convinced that he marks our path. He guides our footsteps. But what we need to do is be attentive to his markings. It's really easy. Well, I don't want to preach all night, so better not get started. Go ahead. Which one are we on to? Oh. Then when we finally got down into Mexico, this is the first lady that we met and began to work with. she still calls us on the phone. She's my age, maybe a year older. She was a school teacher in this rural communities, and God saved her. And part of being a school teacher was marches and things they do for in line with the Catholic Church and the Virgin Mary. And she said she just couldn't do that anymore. With all conscience, she could not do the dances and all the rituals and things. So she quit her teaching job, and then along comes some people who are willing to help her to preach and teach. And she helped us to plant the first, 15 churches in Mexico, the first 14 years or something like that. But this is our Lisa over on this side, and that's her Pablo.
She said it was Africa and America.
Yeah, that's what she said. And so, that's my mom and dad when they later came down to visit us and decided to spend their winters with us. And that's Melissa. That's how big she was back then when we went in there. And she always had a row of little kids with her. And in the daytime, she'd be playing Bible school when we were around in the villages. Okay, there's another one. These are the early days of our work in Mexico. The way we began to reach people was we had fellowship meetings and conventions and gathered the preachers who were sensing a call to ministry, and they helped me to learn the language. I helped them to learn the biblical truths, and together we planted churches. The first 4 months I had to use an interpreter, and the man at the top of the stairs with his daughter in his arms and me standing behind him a little bit there, that's Zacharias Vasquez. He was my tutor for 4 months. Another one of the ministers that we worked with for a while. And in the nights, you just go down to the end of the street and look for a little cart like this. They'll have somebody selling tacos. Or we bought a taco plate for 8 cents, if you can imagine. And soda was a nickel. It was 5 cents. It was warm. It would have been more for the children, probably. And the building in the background you can see is a adobe brick house. When we took the word into this village, they responded really great. And the lady who owned the adobe brick house was in the States, and she gave her family permission to use the house, and so we made it the church house. And we had lots of time with the people. There it is again. Funny one on that Lupita, the one you saw first with Lisa. She would get the people together into the building, and then I'd do the best I could to talk to them or teach them. And so this particular day, I thought, I'm getting pretty good at this stuff. This language is coming easier than I thought. And so I get in this house, I get up in front of the crowd, and I began to show how much I knew by from memory quoting in Spanish Psalms 105. I've forgotten the reference. But anyhow, it's the one that says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." Well, I'm going through that thing in Spanish, and I said, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and light on my truck." And she said, no, brother, no, not truck. It's pathway. Okay? And then in the very beginning, we began to invite people to travel with us, especially if I traveled alone in Mexico. And these are two of the brethren that came down. On a slide previously, there was a school bus, white one in the background. That school bus drove all the way from Des Moines, Iowa, to Texas to be with us and hold meetings in the summertime. That's how we did this. Some of the times we did, in the early years when we were studying the Roman Catholic culture of Mexico, we would travel to Mexico City to the Basilica just to see how the people worship, to learn their worship patterns. And this was one Christmas that we traveled down there. Judy was standing there. She is again in front of the door. You can move through these, Judy. That's a very typical, it was in 1968. That was a very typical church house with adobe walls and palm roof. And that's also very typical of the kind of crowds that we packed into those houses and the people who came to the Lord through those days. We called this a 7-Eleven. It was the closest place that we could get a soda to drink, and it was hot. I mean, in the summertime, there is no ice, so the al tiempo, they say, which means whatever climate it is. There again, that's the inside. That's in Judy.
That's Raymond Jones.
Yeah, it is Raymond Jones. I was interpreting for him. There, that's a picture of him again. And some of you would remember Raymond Jones. He used to had a radio broadcast in Greencastle. Well, we had it here in Chambersburg too. I've forgotten now. Word of Life, I think it might have been. He pastored a church in Martinsburg. We became friends a couple years before we left for Mexico, and then he connected. Yeah. The stove. That one didn't make it. We were in gravel roads with creek bottom for grading, and of course Melissa had to come back and make sure that I fixed it right. But that can give you kind of that. Now that's a gas station. When we got off the road, there were no other Pemex stations, so you carried 5-gallon cans. So, or else you found a farm on the road somewhere who would sell you some.
And it's still like that.
Yeah. Here I am over on that side, and that was Lupe's husband, Carlos, on the other side. Just to look out over the, to get a sense of what the terrain looked like. Courtyard, church at the back, a stock tank in the front, and our camper. We finally got rid of the truck or the car and the trailer and got us a truck and camper.
Tell me what the old man said about it.
Oh, the first time we drove into this ranch, I guess it was, there was an old preacher gentleman there who probably walked in, and he was going around talking. He looked at my vehicle, the Buick with the trailer tied on the back end of it. He said, "The brethren have come, and they've got 2 cars. One's welded to the other one." That's in Monterey now, and that's a famous landmark in Monterey called Saddleback Mountain. And at the foothill of that mountain, we were planning at this time a couple of churches. Gives you an idea how it's an oven there in the bottom, right, Judy?
Yes.
That's their cooking. That's their the kitchen with all the cooking utensils. And there was another one of the plazas. Judy was holding Melissa looked like. This one has a story. This is called Purification River. And they didn't have any running water in the village where we were. And so the old gentleman had a donkey cart with a barrel. And he wanted me to go along down to the river to get the drinking water, to get the water. Well, it was all right when we got to the river. It was at bottom, like I was telling you about. And the water was flowing down through there. And it would have been just fine, but when I looked around, he'd rolled his donkey cart right down in the stream. And the donkey needed to relieve himself, and he was relieving himself right where they were going to dip the water out. And it wasn't long after that Melissa came down with hepatitis. And that was my dad's rig, but eventually that's what we ended up with, and we did most of the ministry out of the cab or the back of a pickup and camper. More of the scenes of what the villages looked like where we preached. One night they offered me lodging. It was that table, you can't hardly see it now, but there's a table over on this side, but it laid exactly above the roof line, and it had palm fronds. The next morning I was wet from the dew that came off of the roof. That baptismal service again. They were getting ready to put through power lines, and so they were and irrigation water, and so they were building dams in this area where we were planting. You may end up seeing some of this in our area. They're talking about bringing it back. It's a form of hemp that they use rope. They made ropes and baler twine out of it back in our days. Every stock of that the farmers had in their ground harvested each year for 1 peso. The person per head. The one thing that became pretty much of a tradition with us was that every year we would get a caravan together and we would go to the churches and carry Christmas to them. Mostly it was food articles and blankets. I know that Montgomery and maybe Air Hill and several of the churches, the women quilted, and then they'd pack us up with small girls' dresses and quilts. And that's what your streets look like. Many of them still like that around Monterey. Now, Elaine was just here to see us this week, and there she was. She worked with us for quite a while in the early years. Between 1973 and 1996 or something like that, the Brother in Christ had a church. We had a church in South Texas on the border. You hear talk these days about McAllen, Texas. This church was like 3 miles from the downtown part of McAllen in a town called Farr. Now, that was the house that we lived in most of the years that we were working in Mexico, the earlier years. There was a gift from God. That happened to be a triplex, and we were able to live in one of the units, and the rent of the other units covered the cost of the housing. And this was one of our Bible schools. The old bus in the back was donated to the church in Texas from the Thomas, Oklahoma Brethren in Christ Church. In the early days of that church, the congregation that only spoke Spanish was probably half of the whole congregation. So Henry Landis was the first pastor, and he didn't speak Spanish. So on weekends when I used to travel, they'd invite me to stay at home and interpret for Henry. And we developed a closed circuit sound system in that old church. And what I had was a headgear on where I could hear what Henry was saying, and then I could translate it as fast as he was preaching it. And he came to me one day and he said, "This is absolutely amazing." He said, I preach my sermon, I make my point, and before I'm finished making my point, the Spanish-speaking people were saying amen. But it was amazing. God gave me grace to be able to do. There it is again. Now, I didn't want anybody walking into that room after the church started, because if you couldn't stay focused, Henry would give me the scriptures that he was going to use, and then I soon learned his style, and it was really quite easy to do. They're making concrete there. There go the trusses up on the roof. And then we did have parties once in a while. Okay. This is Lupe and Carlos and her oldest little boy. They had 3 children. That's Lisa, right? That was the back side of the house that we lived in. And there's Lupita again with her husband Carlos and two of their 3 children.
I think we took in those hats.
The knitted for cold weather. Mm-hmm. I don't know why, but this particular church had 2 entry doors in the back. I don't think it was women and men either. There again, now this would be like at the Christmas time. They got a big old piñata over here at the side, and the kids are trying to bust it open to get the candies. It's a close-up again of Lupita. Yeah. And that was her mama. Lupe's mama. Mm-hmm. There's how you get your water, man. Just put the yoke over your shoulders and run for water. I think it will come to the place where they have the butchering. Yeah. I was remembering with Judy today that part of the reason that the church, and aside from the fact that it was God's appointed time, what this group did was once every 3 months, they had a fellowship meeting, much like your fellowship meals, but when with the preaching to go with it. And so the people would come in. Their transportation in those days was an old cattle truck, so flatbed cattle truck. So they would come from the ranches around to a central location, and then they would be there as many as 2 days or 3 days, depending on their schedule at home. And I remember some of the times when the Spirit of God was really moving in a powerful way, and people were getting saved and healed. And one of the ladies came down from in the village. It was this village, I believe. But anyhow, one of the ladies came outside and said, "What a blessing it was to be there, because from the hill, the top of the hill, back where we had come in the entrance to the ranch, they could hear the sound of people rejoicing and praising God." And some 20 more years later, we went to the same village and put a tin roof on a church, and to place the palm 4. And there was a teenager that was working with us, and we, for whatever reason, I don't remember all the details now, but he was working with us, Dad and me, to put this roof on this and finish the benches inside. And in the evening, we had a meeting over at Lupe's house, which was about 45 minutes away. And he had gone with us, and apparently in the middle of the service, the Spirit of the Lord got a hold of him in such a powerful way that the next day he testified that there was a power that was drawing him to the Lord, but he didn't want to go front because he wanted to accept the Lord in his home church where he had worked and helped to put it up. And he did. He did. And the last word I had was that he's still serving the Lord. Oh, that's the old brother that made the statement about the one piece being welded to the other piece. He was cutting up the meat for the butcher under the mesquite tree. And these are the women. Now they're cooking. That's their kitchen. And they're the teenage and girls helping mama to prepare the meal. See, they just have it. It looks like butchering. Just cut it up right there on the table. You want to look for your friendly friend, the dog. He'll be needing a little bit. There was a musician. He's gone to be with the Lord now. His name was Celio. If any of you were here when they had the other big shindig for me, he was a musician from Mexico. That 50th birthday. Anyhow, that's his wife Victoria there. They had 8 or 9 children. Judy had to get in the stew, didn't she?
Oh, I was so tired that day.
Yeah. When Lisa came along, this gal was Judy's nanny to help her with Lisa. There they are again, all locked, all lined up around the back of the truck. And this is one of the man who was my interpreter back then at the beginning. He was showing us one day how you take that hemp and put it on a large boat, and you just keep doing it back and forth, and it wraps itself. So, same courtyard again. Yeah, they'll be down there playing. They'll be shooting marbles in a little bit. This is where we were in the mountains again. Yeah, they're doing marbles. There's a door with that church with 2 doors. In the middle, it had a big beam that went across, and it was about this high. You actually had to duck down under it or get hit in the head. Yeah, guess who? I love the hairdo. You went too fast. Come on, Judy. Now, this is where we took a bunch of the Christmas. This is one of the last churches that we planted in Mexico. Yeah. Yeah. The hanging up on the electric cord. In the early days, we would take lots of loose tracks, and when we went to leave the village, we would spread them out, because a lot of times, especially the husband, wouldn't come into church, and so we would put them out like that. And yeah, that was another one of the girls that helped Judy. She married, and her husband did evangelistic work for a while, quite a while. Do you notice the decorations in the ceiling? It was strictly for looks, to make it look tidy. They would use straws and strings, and they'd string and little paper ringers, or they would cut out a decoration. The women would do, the sisters in the church, just to close the trusses in the top of the church. Kids looking at them, cute little guys. You see this little guy with the toboggan type hat? Second one in from the corner, first one in from the corner. Little short guy. If you were to look at him closely, you'd discover that he is cross-eyed. When we got to his family, his stomach was terribly distended, his eyes were crossed, and we got to asking the parents what was the condition of the child, and they said, and basically he was dying of malnutrition. His mom was pregnant again, and he had no milk. She had no milk for him, and he didn't have money to buy the milk, and so I was there with this group that come from Des Moines, Iowa each year, and I told them the story. They asked if there were any goats, milking goats, in the village that could be purchased. And so they asked around the pastor and his wife, and they found a milking goat, and I forget now what we paid, $8 or something, less than $20 anyhow. And so, understanding the need, we said, this is not your goat now, this is little Daniel's goat. And so we don't want you to sell the goat when times get tough, because it's Daniel's goat. And sure enough, it's turned his life around, saved his life. You would have noticed. That was part of one of the groups that came, yeah. In bus. Some came from Dallas, some came from Des Moines, Iowa, and then Kansas City. And at the end of our first tenure there in 1983, 84, we held a convention with all the ministers and brought them together, giving them an opportunity to organize themselves into a conference. All of the churches that we planted before we left for California, they were all independent churches. Each pastor had the administration of each of the congregations, even the ones we built. And when we left and went to Mexico, or went to California and to work with the gangs in the inner city, then we turned all the churches over to their pastors. And this was one of the assemblies of those pastors. And you know, I don't see a picture, but I have to think to get in the late 70s and early 80s, when we were building these churches and planting the churches. One day, some of the Henry Landis and some of his people from Thomas, Oklahoma, came to help us to build one of the churches. And Grace Freimeyer, her picture was on here, but I haven't seen it yet. No. Well, I was trying to cue it up. You had it there. I didn't see Grace, but I saw the kids all lined up and everything. It would have been in the midst of some of this. Because I remember we climbed up on the back of their pickup and camper to hang up the piñata. These are places where we did baptismal. And see there the pastor is reading scripture down. Sometimes at different times of the late summer, August, September, they get lots of, it may be dry all year, but they really get flash floods when the storms come. And then everybody gets stranded. And this was one of the crossings that we decided not to try. That's what happens if you don't have your chains along. And across the country, as we traveled, we noticed that on mountains and curves and areas like that, or where maybe there's been an accident, they would build these little shrines. And then you drive by and all those little tiny lights were candles that were burning. And they were asked, it was a prayer chapel for people to pray for them or their situation they were in. Okay. This was the beach line in the back there of Cuba, not far at all from the Cuatro Caminos Church, the Brother in Christ Church.
We took them there for their anniversary.
The couple. That's Daniel and Sarah, and it would.
Daniel and Sarah.
Yeah, and the 2 children.
Uh-huh.
Of course, they're babies, they don't have their own children.
Yep, that's the beach line. Cuba has beautiful, beautiful water, beautiful beach lines. This one, the one here, is Daniel's oldest daughter, Helen. She lives here in Chambersburg now, and that was there. And that was this girlfriend of Judy's, and the other one before that was her little girl. There it is again. But now this one of these couples lived in a house that was like 15 by 15 on top of another house.
Now, this was Sodom, not his.
Yeah, that's not. Yeah, that wasn't the house, but the little girl lives in a.
Oh, yeah.
There, yeah, in a typical street in Cuba. And we did a general conference in Cuba every year, once a year, and that's what they're cooking for there. And boniato, which is sweet potatoes, and the mode of transportation most popular in Cuba is a bicycle. At one time, the government gave all working people a bicycle, and they would ride their bicycles to church, but there was so much thievery in the community that someone would have to sit at the door or back at the other end to make sure someone didn't. They would come up to visit in your house and say, well, that's a church door, but their houses were like that too. And they would actually park their bike. There was a way you could turn the pedal that it would hold where it wouldn't fall down. And so they'd put it up against the curb with that pedal set like that. And then they'd sit in the doorway watching their bicycle while they were talking to whoever, us or whoever else they were working with.
Oh, we got ice cream.
Oh yeah, this woman and her ice cream. And this boy, he became ingenious. He probably had an engineering degree from Messiah College. He found these frames and he welded them together. And it looks like 3 frames. And then he put a platform at the back there, and he set a little, like a lawnmower or a small tractor engine in there. And he would go around the back and pull the rope, and the thing would crank, and then he'd push the pedal and away she'd go. Only thing was, they told me later, somebody told me, maybe Daniel, that he was too modern for the the controls that they had on the gasoline and all. I mean, you had to have a coupon to get gas. There's the back end of her. And anyhow, they made him quit riding it. Then when you didn't have one of those, you rode in this thing, like a covered wagon. There's the daddy of that little girl, yeah. And he was a guard at the down at the dock. There's Helen again. Yeah. Can you see our kids sitting down like that? That was Raphael. No, that was what's her name? What they're doing there is picking the trash out of their rice, and the sad part was that the first grade stuff was all exported, and what was second grade they gave to the people with their coupon book. So yeah, that's it. That's the family. It's a family, Judy. This is at 15 foot by 15 foot house. Now there's 2 of us. See how we're at the table there? And then there's a little kitchen behind him. The bed was here, and it was just like barely a place to walk through between. there are a lot of people in the world that are a lot, what would I say?
That's when they got to move the bicycle, so.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they took, it looks like Helen's picture again. This man had a problem with cigars. And he had come up, we were having convention that year, and he was a member of the, well, he probably wasn't then, because Juana wouldn't have let him in the house because he smoked. But he came to me this particular night and he said, brother, he said, please pray for me. Pray that I get delivered from this terrible habit that I have. And that's what we were doing there. And he ultimately was delivered of it. Carlos Manuel. Jack and Trudy McLean are in the middle. Yeah, director of the Brother in Christ Mission. And Daniel, myself, Judy, Jack, Trudy, and Sarah. And that was in Cuatro Caminos. That arched deal in the front of the church there, that's the baptistry.
It's just the ministry.
During the daytime, at the conferences, we held teaching training sessions. And this is one of them. That's the interior of the Cuatro Caminos Church. They probably would, the way we packed them in, probably 350 or more.
Oh, this is the big conference.
Yeah. You can't, yeah, we're having, yeah, evening meeting. But you can't see it there, but that, the ceiling, there you can see the crowd we had. But the ceiling in that church made a beautiful hiding place for bats. And they found them. And so finally, it was so bad that they said they had to scoop it out. That's how bad it was in there. And so they got the bright idea to take the ceiling down. Some places you can probably still see the moldings that held the ceiling up, the false ceiling up. Well, anyhow, they had it all cleaned up and everything, working nice and everything. Till one evening we were having church, and it was had to be in the teaching time, and it's kind of quiet and still. And about that time, one of those bats let out one of the shrieks that they do, and went down through there, right around like this. Imagine if one was turned loose in here, and the fans, the ceiling fans, were hanging on a piece of conduit, and his radar didn't work very well because he plowed right into that fan and hit the floor. Man, now you talk about women shuffling. I mean, it moved. But it gives you an idea of what kind of response we had. It was tremendous, and lives changed. There's Jack preparing again for evening service. Little guy.
And the crowd was so big.
Yeah, no, you just, in that last one, particular one, this one too, pretty much the men stand around the outside of the church, and then the women push those long benches together, and the women and children sit on them. When we first went there in 92, the Cuatro Caminos Church and this church were the only two active churches. Everybody else met in house churches. And this was called Nazareno. Daniel told me, I asked him recently, what the ministry looks like in Cuba now. He says that over the whole island, they now have 1,000 churches. And it was a tremendous revival that swept the island in the around the year 2000. Judy with her ice cream cup. Daniel's oldest girl had a tremendous fear of any kind of bug. And she had a friend who kept coming back up the wall and wanting to get in her bed. And she wasn't happy about it all. Here we are again. I'm telling you. So we had during our ministry, it's not a big thing brag about, because the Lord's the one that did the work. But while we were holding this service here, see the gentleman with the mic right close to his face? Well, this minister here on the left had come to Cuba to do some ministry, and was in the service with us one night. And this gentleman on the right here said that he was deaf. He couldn't hear. And when he finished praying for him, he had his hearing back. And there he's praying for him right there. One night in Mexico, a friend of mine from Oklahoma, evangelist friend, had come down, and we were just sitting on the pulpit waiting for service to start. And we had a pretty full house of women and children. And all of a sudden, one of the boys said, "Mommy, I can see." And all of a sudden, you imagine what happened when he said that. I mean, it was like everybody wanted to touch the preacher. And afterward, I noticed that when Lupe, the gal that we started with, it was her church, it was the one she pastored. I noticed that after the word spread through the congregation that this little boy had been healed while he was sitting there waiting to have to start service, all of a sudden she burst out and worshiping God and crying and praying. And she came to me and said, "I've been praying for those two ladies." She said, the one of them is a lady of the street. And she said, "I've been praying that she'd get saved." And that night she did. It was and the little boy, her little boy, was healed. This couple that's there with me in the middle, they were recently married, and they were trying to discover what it was that God was leading them into, what He was saying to them. And I had a chance to pour our testimony into their life, and they decided that they then would begin their ministry with us. And for a while they pastored one of the Brother in Christ house churches. Then they came to the States and lived in Alexandria, Virginia. And I went down and met with them there, and they were working then with the Church of God of Prophecy. And then they eventually went back to Miami, and they already have their house purchased and everything. They're going to move back into the Havana area. They got a pass to come to the States, but they really feel like they need to go back, and both of them are totally bilingual, very, very capable kids. The girl herself is a daughter of the leader of the Church of God of Prophecy in Cuba. And that's the new airport in Cuba, at least the last time we went. And the Canadian government is the one that funded this. There's a lot of tourism between Canada and Cuba. This was where we had the Bible school the first year we were there, first and second year, where we trained 13 or 14 pastors and planted the early churches. We're back around now. Was that the third one? Thank you guys for being so patient.
Well, that covered both a very young version of LeRoy and Judy, and then when we got to Cuba, a little older version. In between Mexico and Cuba, there was some time in California,
5 years,
and then some time in Venezuela. And I know occasionally whenever I travel into Romania, the thing that I am struck with is what it might be like someday to be before the throne of God. Mm-hmm. And have some glimpse of people all around the world that have been influenced and brought to the Lord. It might be somebody that you've ministered to right here, locally, but then God took them, mm-hmm. and God moved them, and they traveled, and they ended up somewhere, and you'll be able to see how you had a hand in them coming to the Lord. Maybe you gave to missions. Maybe you sent a word of encouragement to a missionary. And in some way, you're going to be able to see how God used that to bring people the world over. Any particular questions that you might have as it relates to Venezuela, Cuba, Mexico, parts that they were in, churches, ministry? What particular part of Venezuela was it that you were in? Was it Caracas?
The church was in Caracas, the Brother in Christ Church. And they had 2 or 3 units there. But we were 75 miles west in Cagua, where Alan Zeta Book had started that church. And
When did you take your first trip to Mexico?
January the 1st of 1968. Yeah. Well, let's get...
Went to labor 7 months. We were 6 hours from the
Border.
first hospital,
Border. Mm-hmm.
from the border. And I was crying. I mean, I was scared because I was supposed to have cesarean. And I said, I don't want them to cut me. And I just prayed, and the Lord helped me to get to the border. He just was with us all the time.
It was 1984 then when we transitioned to LA.
Okay.
Then we did almost 5 years in inner city LA, working with gangs and planting the church, Gethsemane. And then in 92 was when we went to Venezuela. Can I share one more thing?
Sure.
Really, I sensed that God called me to Cuba, seriously, in a service much like this, in the New Guilford Church in 1954, 53, somewhere along in there. But I kept, it just didn't seem to be happening, and that's why we went on to Mexico. I felt a strong urge to move with the Spirit, but it wasn't the way I thought it was going to move. But anyhow, through all of that, we did our ministry and went to California, did it there, came back, and were invited to go to Cuba by the mission. We had been there about a year and a half or 2 years, maybe a bit more. And in Venezuela, working into Cuba. And on this one particular night, they were having an administrative board meeting, and the different workers, members, their church board, in other words, it wasn't meshing. And it kept getting more tense and more tense and more tense. And it finally got so bad that I actually was still chairing the board because they could not find agreement in who should lead the church. And so I got up and I said, we've done enough tonight. It's time to pray and go home. And that's what happened. We did. And a couple of days later, we were in a meeting, and things were beginning to smooth out, and we were walking through some stuff, and finally I just felt the Spirit of the Lord that I should share with them, my journey. And I said, I was 12 years old when I first believed or accepted the call that God was laying on my life to come to Cuba. I said, now 39 or 38 years or something like that have passed, and I said, what we've experienced in the last several days, because we began to come together and they were taking counsel as to what the church should look like and what kind of leadership they needed. I said, if I would have come when I sensed the call way back in the 50s, I couldn't have helped you these days. But I said, I'm sorry. I said, God has helped us, and He's allowed us to come to this moment. And now here I am. I can help you with some things. And man, can you imagine the way my heart rejoiced when the other day I asked Daniel about how many churches were active in Cuba. I mean, we had 2, and people looking for places to meet under trees. No, sometimes 8 people met on a week when times were really, really bad. And so it's amazing. Wow. The challenge that we could leave you with is this. Judy and I are really trying to discover, what do we do now? I knew this day would come, but I didn't know it'd come this soon. So you pray for us. I believe that God still has a work for us to do. Yesterday, last night, this morning, there was a young fellow that we led to the Lord back some couple of years ago, and he was in my front room wanting to counsel. So there still is a ministry to do. Just to, keep her chin up, they used to say, and knees down. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm thankful for the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament, though it doesn't present the gospel of grace, it presents real lives of real people.
It sure does.
And their struggles in walking with God. And one of the characters I appreciate, the picture that it gives, and I've mentioned it many times, is that of Elijah. I get the idea that Elijah was a sort of a gung-ho, unstoppable, force to be reckoned with kind of a guy. I'm going to serve the Lord no matter what. But yet Elijah went through times where he absolutely did not know what he was going to do. And that caused him discouragement, and he questioned God and said, God, what am I going to do? What do you have for me? And he went through some pretty dry times. And yet God continued to carry him through. And so I don't have God's particular answer, but I know that God will continue to carry you through. I would just like to close in a word of prayer around LeRoy and Judy. As they walk through some of those times ahead, they're not sure exactly what that means for them. And we can just lift them up in prayer and encourage them. So if you would, just come up with us, and we'll close in a word of prayer around Brother LeRoy and Sister Judy.